Hey everyone, hope you're having a great week and welcome to our final lecture of the class that went by really, really fast. It always does and it still always boggles my mind. So I think this week will be fair on the lighter side because it's not going to, there's only one chapter and there's not a ton of meat here. I mean, they're sort of wrapping up the class and they're talking about international perspectives, which is good information for you to know depending on where you would like to take your career. But yeah, should be a pretty light and easy discussion. There are some changes to how we're doing things this week, so make sure that you're reading in the discussion forum in terms of how I framed this week out and what you need to do. And the LMS looks a little bit different. Some of the points are a little bit different and things like that. So just make sure you're reading what you have to do and that we're right where we need to be. So they spend a lot of time in this chapter talking about different international organizations, and in fact, your assignment this week is going to be doing your own summary about an organization, not necessarily an international one. I debated doing that because that's sort of where the textbook was leading, but I decided against it because I don't feel that most of you are going to be working internationally, so this is good to know, but definitely not an essential, in my opinion. And I thought it might be more beneficial for you to share organizations in your local area or national organizations for which there's a local chapter that you want to share, because I think that would be more beneficial to share with your colleagues and learn from each other, because the professional organizations that you associate with will be really critical for your jobs. And also for looking for jobs. You never know. These might be places that you could potentially be working. So these are some of the organizations, the international organizations that are highlighted in the book. So again, a good to know, but in my opinion, not terribly essential. I also apologize. You might be hearing my dog downstairs. He's woofing, or one of our dogs, I should say. So the United Nations, or the UN, is an international organization that promotes worldwide peace and global cooperation. The Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities addressing the rights of deaf people to participate in all aspects of civil society, including education, justice, government, and culture. I think these are important to highlight too, because it's really interesting to know that when you think about professional organizations within deaf culture or things that impact this field, this probably isn't something that would be on your radar, but in fact it is part of their mission, and they do include deafness and the rights of people with disabilities. So this is really important to know that they exist and how they are really critical and important allies to our work. The World Federation of the Deaf, I apologize. Actually, it's not my dog, it's my neighbor's dog. That's who's woofing. So I don't know if my microphone's picking it up. World Federation of the Deaf, international non-governmental organization of people with disabilities in the world. The International Federation of Translators, National Association of Spoken Language Interpreters, Translators, and Terminologists. The International Association of Conference Interpreters. Who knew that it got this granular? There's a Professional Association of Language Conference Interpreters, which is very specific. The Canadian Association of Sign Language Interpreters, formerly the Association of Visual Language Interpreters of Canada, which is a nonprofit professional association for interpreters whose working languages include a sign language. International, continuing on with the international, the European Forum of Sign Language Interpreters, established to bring interpreters together across European countries. The World Association of Sign Language Interpreters, or WASLI, the culmination of international gatherings at WFD congresses and conferences. It represents the interests of signed language interpreters globally. So WASLI's structure includes membership of national interpreter associations, where you'd be a voting member, selection of regional representatives at a continental level, who work at a multi-country level to support the development of interpreter associations and education in each country. The Critical Link International, established with the goal of enhancing the training opportunities and working conditions of community interpreters internationally. Now, I have to pause here and just say a moment about working internationally or part of these international groups. You might be thinking, what does this even have to do with me? I live in South Carolina or wherever you live. And so you're not like, I'm not going to be working across the globe, but especially since COVID and the fact that so much is done remotely these days, there absolutely is always a possibility that you could be working globally, and there's opportunities out there. So if that's something that you're interested in doing, it doesn't even necessarily mean that you're physically moving across the globe. You might be working internationally, even if it's just over the border in Canada. In fact, I remember having this conversation in another class where I interviewed the author of the book, Marty Taylor, who wrote one of the ASL books. And she's actually based out of Canada, and she talks a lot about, a lot of what she does is remote, and she's interpreting around the globe, in the US and other countries, and she's doing it from Canada. So she talks a lot about like the different work that she's doing. And so there is definitely still a need. And so if that's something that you have an interest in doing, or you're one of our global learners, that you're automatically international. So that doesn't mean that you can't be working in the US or in other countries, even from where you are. Not all countries have long offered testing and accreditation processes for sign language interpreters. Globally, education opportunities for sign language interpreters range. Some have no training available. Some have short-term workshops and courses that just last a few weeks. And some have college-level 2- and 3-year programs. And so within this context, there are also generally no standard requirements for becoming certified. Most Western Europe or European countries require interpreters to obtain a bachelor's degree in interpreting in order to be able to work, which all of you will qualify after you finish the program and get your degree. Testing may also be available via a professional interpreter association as opposed to a university, an independent registration body, or a deaf association. In Canada, interpreter education is delivered at 6 post-secondary institutions. So it's really important to, if you're interested in any kind of international work, that you understand what the standards are, how they might differ from the US. And that doesn't mean that you can't work there, but you need to understand what the differences are and what you might need. There might be a little gap in your training, although I think it's safe to say that in most cases, with the exception of maybe Canada, you are going to already have most of those credentials that maybe other countries are not requiring. So you might actually be overqualified for some of these jobs. But again, you just want to make sure that you understand what is the criteria in the country that you're seeking to work, so that it's, that there's a continuity there. For all countries around the globe, interpreting services have historically been delivered by the national, state, or regional associations of the deaf, with interpreters employed through those venues to provide interpreting services to the broader deaf community. The passage and ratification of the UN Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, there has been a move away from deaf associations holding governments accountable for interpreting services. This has resulted in the loss of historic deaf-centered oversight, which also provided vetting of interpreters. And in many of these income-poor, knowledge-rich regions, a push for increased access to training and educational opportunities has resulted in interpreters to demand higher salaries and wages, which there's pros and cons to that. Here are some common trends that have been observed across 80 countries. Increasing pressure on governments to recognize the human rights of deaf citizens, following the requirements for qualified professional interpreters to be used when providing interpreting services. These demands have gathered steam due to the increased visibility of sign language interpreters on televised proceedings. a rights-based frame of reference. Deaf communities are increasingly using their political knowledge and power of social media to engage decision makers and political figures in public debate to affect change. Discussions abound regarding the role of deaf interpreters and moving from a traditional conceptualization to that of becoming the political face of signed language access. I think there's still a lot of talk about using CDIs, and a lot of people don't even understand what that is or the benefits, and so that's still an emerging topic in a lot of places that I'm hearing about. The demand for quality interpreter training is a common theme across every country, and the rise of deaf professional across a range of professions goes hand in hand with the need for interpreters to have a solid academic background and interpreting abilities. Across Europe, the demand for interpreters to work in high-level meetings is on the rise. And here in the US, I keep hearing anecdotally, there's, I think the most polarizing is interpreting within educational systems, and that there is a lack of continuity of skill, training, and what is acceptable to interpret in an educational setting. It really runs the gamut, and the skill level is kind of all over the place. There's some interpreters working in education that are highly skilled, and there are some that, quite frankly, shouldn't be there. When interpreters cut or significantly reduce ties and commitments to the deaf community, they can expect that interpreting skills and understanding of the norms and expectations of deaf individuals will suffer stagnation. If we lose our connections to the deaf community or fail to develop and nurture those connections, how will interpreters be able to provide interpretation that are rooted in cross-cultural knowledge and experience? I think at the crux of everything, this is sort of like at the most pivotal part of what we do. How does one become an international sign interpreter? Well, for more information, you can see the website at wasley.org. There's two domains where international interpreters work: high-level meetings and academic conferences. So if that's something that is of interest to you, you should check it out. An international interpreter can only excel if they're active in their local deaf community, specifically in their mastery of their local, regional, national sign language. WASLey requires that IS interpreters to have more than 2 spoken languages and or 2 signed languages. So again, for those of you where we talked last week about French Sign Language being an easy pivot, or some other sign language, or you're already fluent or interested in another one, this could be a possible opportunity for you. WASLey recognizes that in some contexts, IS is not a viable practice and should not be assumed or provided in all international events. IS interpretation does not provide complete access to information for many deaf attendees at international conferences or deaf events. National signed languages must be valued, supported, and used as the first option wherever possible and practicable. If an opportunity arises to do some work in another country, you should only accept that opportunity if you can work with local deaf community members in addition to local interpreters. It's critical that we not impose American Sign Language or other killer languages, see this, on countries where national signed languages are being used. When you travel, be cautious and be politically astute. Think deeply about the damage caused when one brings a colonizer mindset when visiting other countries and other cultures. There's a great amount to learn when considering interpreting work in international settings, and it's best learned in collaboration with local deaf and interpreter communities, all working towards the same goals. And then, as usual, there's some resources here that you can consult. Told you this would be short and sweet.